I'm here to interview Sean Gallagher about replicating springs from his original springs from Joe Pilates' studio. Okay, so I'm going to get started. Sean, can you tell us a little bit, how did you, we know that you have the Pilates archives, but how did you obtain the actual springs that Joe used?
Well, it's when I bought the property.
Okay.
So when I bought, the property, and we'll talk when we talk with Norton Owen from the Pillow, we'll talk a lot more about that. But, it had his original equipment. And along with that original equipment was the original springs that he used, still attached to the apparatus. Mm-hmm. So I was like, well, because like when I first looked at the property, I told the owner, I said, well, I'm not really interested in the property, but I'll buy the equipment. And he came back and said, if you want the equipment, you got to buy the property. Okay. So I ended up buying it, and because if I hadn't, more likely than not, whoever else bought it, if they didn't know anything about Pilates, they probably would have just, what's this? Throw it away, get rid of it. Right. So it's good. And so then what I did is, I bought the property in '97, and then I bought Ridgetone and started looking to make equipment afterwards, right? Because once I had the equipment, I really wanted to, start making Joe's actual, reproducing his equipment. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I did is I went and worked with the spring manufacturer and took the spring and I said, I have this spring, can you reproduce it for me? And
so really quick, so you're talking about the reformer springs right now?
Well, there's I also got, that's the reformer spring, the chair springs. Okay. The arm and leg springs, the heavy and light, that all came from there. The neck stretcher and the hand tensometer and toe strengthener, they came when I bought the business from Weetie.
Okay, so just to sort of give an overview, so you have the original reformer springs, those you got from Beckett. Mm-hmm. You have original arm springs, heavy and light. Yep. Original leg springs, heavy and light, and original one-to-chair springs, and those were all also from Beckett. Right. Then you have the toe corrector, hand tensometer, and neck stretcher, and those were from Weetie from Joe's New York City studio. Right. Okay, cool.
Yeah. So
that's quite the collection.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I've been, when I made the equipment, I had all those springs reproduced. Okay. So now I have chair springs, and I have leg springs and some arm springs. Some of them got a little rusty, so I can't use those, but there's still some that are, and I'm going to probably put them on the Etsy store at some point this year.
The non-rusty ones.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, unless you want an original rusty one.
That's the patina.
Yeah, there you go.
So,
well, I'll put that out at the Pillow and make them cheap. You can buy the rusty spring, just to hang on the wall.
Art.
Like you hang all this stuff all over your wall. Yeah. So, you can have a special spring collection from Joe's,
Well, 90s rust, so.
Yeah, just like Joe's, though.
Yeah. Okay. So you're talking like in the 90s when you were reproducing the clawfoot reformer, like we talked about a few days ago.
The cloth reformer?
Clawfoot.
Oh, clawfoot, yes.
Then you had also, the springs you put on it were also replicas of the original springs?
Yeah.
Wow.
So anything that I made had the same as, that's again, one of the transfers was to do that was to also have the original equipment with the original tension of the springs because, what's happened in more contemporary than classical, in contemporary they've tried to infuse traditional strengthening ideology, which is, to get stronger you have to have more resistance. So they have light, medium, heavy, and all these different springs for the reformer, and that's not how Joe, Joe was, that's not what Joe did. Joe's springs were set, for a certain reason, and the 2, 1, 3, or 4 setting on the apparatus works the body a certain way. Mm-hmm. And so when it's not about whether it's heavy or light. You can use that ideology if you want, but that tends to be more single muscle and muscle group and not full body workout like Joe was really intentional.
Well, what you're specifying here is on the reformer though, right? Because you said he did have heavy and light arm and leg springs.
Right, but I'm talking about for the reformer.
Okay. Right. So when you saw the heavy and light springs on the Cadillac, were you surprised that there was 2 different tensions, or was that the first you had heard of such a thing or seen it?
I was surprised, because that really wasn't how it was done.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of other springs there. I mean, I have a box full of springs. Now, what people need to realize is that Joe was frugal, and he went through the Depression, and most people went through the Depression, didn't waste things.
Mm-hmm.
So if a spring broke, he reused it. He put a little, hook into it and still use it. I mean, at least that it was set up that way. Whether how he used it, when he used it, I don't know.
So the springs were like loose, the
Yeah.
broken ones. You
Yeah.
found them and they were repaired.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, in the studio in Beckett, he had a little cabinet, a shelving full of shelves, and there was all these different types of springs there. There's some really light springs, and then there's even lighter and this and that. But what I did is I took the springs that were on the apparatus, and that's how I used it. The stuff that was on the shelves, I wasn't sure how he used it or what he used it for. As far as I know, he got it and used it once and didn't like it, or he maybe used it all the time. But the stuff that was on the apparatus, it was pretty obvious that that's what he was using. So that's what I reproduced.
Yeah, like I was thinking, if he had like kind of one-offs, he could have, bought a few different springs and been like, let me try these out, and then
Right.
gotten at home and been like, yeah, no, but just kept it because he was going to keep it because he bought
Well, you
it.
don't throw things away.
Yeah,
You didn't-
yeah.
I mean, you didn't really, and I mean, it's not like and it wasn't like there was lots and lots of the same spring. It was like he had, a set of these, a set of these, a set, so it wasn't like, and I didn't find any boxes or anything like that full of extra springs,
So
like your back room that's got all those springs in it.
I actually thought that there is one more set of springs that you also have that's original. It's the foot corrector.
Yes, that's true too.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
I do have, because I had the foot corrector from Weetie, and so I have that compression spring.
I've always wondered about the foot corrector. Is the spring actually lighter, the original spring? Because in the pictures, Joe's pictures on the foot corrector, it goes all the way down. I mean, it's obviously different.
Yep.
So I don't know. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think things have changed in general? As far, I mean, obviously, I guess people don't have access to these original springs except you have them in your collection.
Well,
But
I think what happens is that when you manufacture a spring, there is a deviation.
Okay.
It's like plus or minus. When you order it, they say, because what I did is I said I took the springs to the manufacturer and I said it has to move this far, and I said how much force is that,
okay,
right? Because you can measure the force. You put a dynamometer on the end of it, and you can measure and see exactly what, if I go out 2 inches, it creates this much force. If I go out this far, 6 inches, it creates that. So I measured from, when you would take the carriage out from the closed position, and the closed position is, there's other things that have changed, because on Joe's reformer, when you bring the carriage in, it's not loose.
okay,
There's just a little bit of tension on the spring. That's the way he did it. That's the way I made him.
okay,
Because that's how he did it. So I was okay with that. So, but and so when you look at a spring, I do a whole webinar workshop on this. There's all these things that you have to look at. But one of those was to how far else, how much force is it does. Well, that is going to depend on the type of spring, the coil, how big the coil is, because you can have a big coil, you can have a small coil. You can have a thick spring or a thinner spring, so all these little factors make an issue,
okay,
make a difference, and then how you attach it and how you close it and all those different things. So I went into the manufacturer and said that, I want to be able to reproduce what Joe did. So they said, well, you have to do these measurements. So I did the measurements. I took it to them, and they reproduced it, and, within that variance.
okay.
So now, most people who wanted to make springs, they said, I can guarantee you, because I know that this has already happened to me, which is basically, a manufacturer. I came up and I produced these springs, right? And then within 6 months, somebody who worked for them bought them, and then all of a sudden they had, we found these springs that were from Clara. They, for 40 years, they weren't anywhere, and now all of a sudden somebody finds them and they start using them. So, and the person that worked for them bought my spring. So I'm just saying, you can, maybe Maybe that's the case. But
yeah, I understand.
they basically, you can take a spring and you can do the same thing I did. If you buy one of my springs, somebody can take it to a spring manufacturer and say, can you make it for me? Or they get it and they look at it and they say, oh, it looks like that, and they go to the store and then they buy one, but they didn't do those measurements, so it may not be the same. And so I don't, so there's lots of ways that things can change.
Yes.
And like I said, for the contemporary people, they try to come in with a different ideology on how to use, bringing a different system into Pilates and trying to infuse it into there. So they change the springs, and and they give them different colors and all this other stuff. And again, if that works for that system and the way they're working it, that's great. That's fine. It's just not how Joe did his system and how he worked his system and the tension. And I know that now it's changing, but when I first started bringing these springs out, they were quite a bit heavier than everybody else's. Yes. And, even Gratz, though, at one point, Gratz lost his supplier. And so he bought springs from me. I think he bought like 600 springs.
This was in the 90s?
I think it was in the 2000s.
Okay.
He had lost his supplier. And David reached out to me and said, can I get springs for you? Because I had it. And,
Donald?
So it was probably early 2000s.
Was it Donald?
No.
Oh, it was David.
It was David. And so, and then, I sold him barrels or 2 barrels full of springs.
Okay. That's cool. Now, another question before we get to the actual springs.
Well, Helen, that's what it was, that he had heavy and light arm springs. So, you could do, and again, it's interesting because the heavy are, there's usually for who? The men. And the lighter for the women. So I think that's what it was, a little bit more than that. And if you look at some of the pictures, like Chuck's pictures and some other things, you can see that Joe had springs that he took too far. So the heavier, you'd have to, the lighter you can stretch farther. So if a guy got the light ones and he was expecting heavy, he would maybe take it too far. And, when you look at Wolff's Law in relationship to springs and elasticity and things like that, there's a certain elastic component and then it comes back. But if you take it too far, it no longer comes back. And if you look at some of those pictures of the springs that Joe had, when they were closed, they were still open, which tells you it was taken too far.
Yeah, there's some pictures, like you said, in Chuck Rappaport's photos, you can see the coils are pulled open, like on the rollback bar.
Right.
And then in the Corolla Trier pictures, also on her junior reformer, the coils are all opened up in weird ways. It's like,
well, and again, maybe she put a different spring on and it was not the right size. I mean, all those things are possible. But
they kept using them.
So, no, they're not light. They're not lighter like the baby chair. Baby chair is very light, and there are a couple springs up in Beckett that are close to the baby chair. But he didn't have a baby chair there. He had the chairs that the baby chair is designed from, but it was just the chair. It didn't have the back part with the springs attachment. He just, I have a couple of those basic chairs that he had for sitting around and, drinking beer and smoking a cigar and having conversations with everybody, I think.
Now, another question I have for you is, as far as long neck, did you see any long neck springs? Do you have any, or, did he have any in his collection? Were they used?
There was none that I had. But we know that if you look at, again, these are Chuck's pictures, so Chuck should be happy. People are going to go look at his pictures, maybe buy some. On the Cadillac, there were long neck springs. Yeah. There weren't any, and if you look at the springs on his pictures, there's no long neck on his reformer. So I think what happened is that that's just got, switched over somehow.
The long neck springs on the Cadillac were for the push-through bar.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they became, maybe they ran out or something, and they started using them for the reformer, and that's how it changed. But, in all the archives, I don't see any long neck springs in any of the reformer pictures that I can see. Yeah. And there's not a lot. I mean, it's not like he changed the springs depending on the exercise. So I'm pretty sure that he didn't have it on those on the reformer, at least that I can see.
Oh, that you have.
Or that I have.
Okay. All right, so should we talk about or look at some of the springs here?
Yeah, so let's start with the ones that I got from Weetie. So one of the things that's important, if you look at, just go to any manufacturer's website and look at their toe or finger exercisers, and you'll notice something much different than Joe's springs.
very skinny.
They're skinny and they're small, they're around the same size, but they're, and the wire's much different. So they have, so when you put a big fat spring, it makes it a much different exercise. So these are not designed to do what? They're not designed to do heavy duty work. And I think that, when you're talking about the foot corrector as well, so, some things have gotten heavier, some things have gotten lighter. It's kind of like the reformer springs got lighter, whereas these got heavier. So I don't really know.
So Betty's asking, are these from Russell? Yes.
Yes, these are from Russell, Pilates Lineages, and he worked with me to make these. And, these have, the toe one's very special because it's different than everything else because it also swivels.
And that's also replicated from
Joe,
the original.
From the original that I had, right? So it does this, so same type of thing.
Yes.
You were going to say something?
Oh yeah, what I was going to say was what I like about this is if you're doing like 1 foot, you can rotate 1 foot and the other and swivel the thing, which is nice because that feature is not, you can't do that if it's not swivelly.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's the neck stretcher. And again, this is different. This one is a little bit lighter than Gratz's, right?
Or from anybody's.
From anybody's.
Yeah.
So this is definitely lighter. Now, I in the archives, we can see that there were 2 springs for this. I have a picture where he's using this, and there's 1 spring attached and there's 1 spring hanging. So he look more likely than not he had a heavy and a light for this as well, because you wouldn't put 2 springs on because they'd get in the way. So you would take this off and change the springs depending on the need.
The neck stretcher is still available, I think, Betty, as far as I know. I think he makes a replacement spring. If you want to buy just the spring, you can put it in the neck stretcher you have. Pretty sure. Right. Yeah, unless I don't know about it, but.
Right. So, and it is definitely lighter. And, the other thing about the neck stretcher is, I see everybody teaching this exercise where they attach 2 leg or arm springs to the neck stretcher, and then they do all these exercises. And in the archives, that's never been shown. And to me, what's happened is that, somebody, one of so it could have been Romana, it could have been, I'm not sure who, but they put 2 springs and they added that to it, and it's a mixture because there's exercises where you do the 2 springs and you do a similar exercise, and then you do the neck stretcher. Because in reality, when you start to look at springs and their relationship, right? Well, if you have this spring and this tension, it's supposed to do certain things for the neck. When you add the 2 arm or leg springs, what do you need this for? Why do you need this spring if you have those 2 other springs? It's like it doesn't really make sense.
It's like double for nothing.
It's more than double because the tension of this compared to the tension of 2 of those is a whole different way of doing things. And what Joe had, it was because when you do it, the neck stretcher, and it's really specific for not a particular muscle in the neck, but for the muscles in the neck, and there are a lot of muscles in the neck. Mm-hmm. So it was really there's been and I see it all the time, and I'm like, why?
Yeah.
And I mean, if you want to do one or the other, but it sort of doesn't make any sense to add that extra spring in there because you don't need that attachment to make you can still use the head attachment with the 2 springs and do the same thing, which is how it was done in the archive. So
yeah, because like you said, well, I think on the baby chair it's 2 springs with a head strap,
right?
And then on the standing it would be 1 spring and a head strap,
right?
And then neck stretcher is just neck stretcher,
right?
Yeah.
And to me that's the progression. It's like you start with the neck stretcher and you build the foundational strength again, which is usually what we do in Pilates, the foundational strength. And then you progress it to the more advanced stuff in the heavier springs. And I guess you can add the 2, but it doesn't, it's like, why? Yeah. To me, it makes no sense. And it really makes no sense in the way you do it because also when you look at the science of springs, there's springs in parallel and springs in series, and that's in series. And, it really doesn't make much sense in relationship to the amount of tension you're trying to build because the 2 springs are going to give you so much tension, you don't need that little spring, that attachment at all.
Yeah. So when I see that, I see like, the leg springs getting super stretched and then somebody's having the neck stretcher and the neck stretcher's just closed.
Right. Yeah.
I'm like, why is the neck stretcher there?
Right. It's really not,
yeah.
And then if they push it that far, but then then, you know, that's farther than you did in the archive. You know, that's not
Yeah.
how Joe did it. So, I mean, again, you can make anything up and do anything you want and modify it. I mean, Ramona modified. You know, everybody modified and added and what they remember and what they don't. And so you can do all those things. But if you want to do it the way Joe did it and feel the difference, then you should, you know, neck stretcher, 1 and then 2.
Well, we taught this actually as a workshop at
Yep.
Pilates at the Pillow.
Yep.
We did Joe's circles and squares, and we did the whole thing about, you know, the head spring and the neck stretcher, and we practiced all those archival exercises.
Right.
That was fun.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, and, you know, I have Joe's head strap.
Yeah.
You know, we got that from the studio as well. So I have, you know, all those things we have. Oh, she said grats.
So now we have the leg spring. So here's one of them.
Right?
I'll just duck out of the
So
way.
I don't have both, but the way we would check the leg springs, you know, like, see, this is more of a light one because you know, if you hold the two together, and she doesn't have one here, but the light and heavy, one bends.
I do. Should I
Do
go
you?
get it?
Yeah, go get it.
Okay.
Oh, she does have one. So, and I can, you know, that's how we always test. And, you know, it's the amount of tension that the spring has. So this leg spring has these open coiled ends, right? You know, different than when you look at the chair spring with the hook end, or the reformers. That's the reformer, or the chair. Here's the chair, and we'll talk about that as well. So, and when you look at the diameter of this wire, it's not that much different. So when they make heavy and light, it's more about how they tension the spring, because, you know, you can tension this spring in different ways when it's closed. So the wire is almost exactly the same. Might be slightly different. So,
It's the arm spring.
all right. So if you look here, you can see, that's a weird look, but on the film, but you can see that one is more flexible than the other. All right, and that's how you know, because, you know, this is the light and this is the heavy. I know it looks pretty bad. Sorry about that, everybody, but that's how I look at it. You know, and if you're going to show it on the camera, if I did it front forward, you wouldn't notice it. Okay.
That's a huge difference.
Yes. Right, and then do you have the can we get the baby spring, armchair spring? So, just to show you what the armchair spring looks like, and again, I have springs like this, but there was no armchair, so he had lighter springs. She's got it. Let's see. She's got to unhook it. So, but yeah, you can see the difference. So this is much stiffer, but if you look at the wire, they're really not that much different in diameter, you know, and so. Right, so you can see the baby, you can see the light, and you can see the heavy. So, you know, and again, this baby one is narrower as well. So it's not, the coil's different, the length is different. There's different things that matter. Now, for the light and heavy, it's the same size, right? They're the same length. They're just wound differently and tightened differently. Okay. Then there's the reformer spring. Right, this one. Again, you know, it had the hooks, and these are the hooks. One's like that, and one's more open. You know, so one is for the back, and one is for the front. To be able to hook it in, okay. And then the chair spring, you know, is so I can show you. Like, here's a reformer spring. So chair spring barely bends. Reformer spring, you know, it comes back pretty quick, but it has a lot more elasticity to it. And there also, if you look closely, you can see that the chair spring wire is thicker than the reformer spring wire. But again, the ends, you know, are closer. So if anything, the chair spring has that long, almost a long neck. So I don't know if that's what happened, you know, what they were doing. So I'm not really sure. I don't know how things changed. You know, and then I guess the last thing, you know, are the handles, you know, that Joe had that are just like this. I think these are not his, but they're very much, you know, the same time period and looked almost exactly the same. Have a little bit more patina than Elaine.
Damn it.
Damn it, I know.
Cool.
Well, if I had a box, I'd give you some, but I don't have a box. I only have a set.
I know.
Okay.
So now I had a question for you when you were,
Breaking her springs, you can't break. You know how hard it is to break a spring?
so Betty's asking, did Joe ever put 4 springs on the Wunda chair? Well, we know that historically the Wunda chair did have 4 springs, but not in his studio, though, right? We know that the Henry Bendel studio, that there's 4 springs on that chair because Blossom has that chair. And I have a chair from Body Art, which was in the 70s, right, Sean? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that chair used to have 4 springs on it, but the person who used to work there, she was a Pilates teacher there. She had the chair. She sold it to me. She actually had Basil take the 2 off and take those hooks out because she didn't like the 4 springs. So that's been modified. But she told me that it had 4 springs, and you can still see the holes where the spring hooks used to be on the pedal. So there were 4 hooks, and they actually had like 5 or 6 hooks down the back sides for the attachment for all those attachments too.
So, and again, we don't know if Joe did that or somebody did it after him because, Bendel's, he started Bendel's, but a lot changed afterwards. So we don't really know if that's the case. But there are, in the archives, there are some other types of chairs that have more than 2 springs as well. So he did play with more than 2 springs. On the chairs. Yeah,
I think he did sort of played with the design of the chair, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's
almost more than any other apparatus, maybe.
Well, he modified it in a number of ways, from the Wunda chair to just like the precursor to the electric chair without those sides or the back, and then he added the handles, and then he made one out of metal, and they had one that was almost like on a rocker. I mean, there was all sorts of, he tried different things for sure.
He had the wheelchair.
And the wheelchair. So he did a lot of different things with the chair because it was about how do you get people, an exercise system that they can use functionally. And the chair was his idea of the first home gym. So way before most.
Yeah. So we have just a couple questions that were sent in about this. So I just want to read you a couple before we go.
And that's for everybody. If you have questions, you can send it to us, and we can, on what's upcoming, and we can answer them, or we can try to answer them here if you're live.
Yeah. If I could just actually find it. Yeah.
Okay.
In 1 second. So one question was, how often should we change springs?
Well, like I said, Joe kept using them even after they broke. But the problem is today, the manufacturers basically say 2 or 3 years. And if you don't follow the manufacturer's suggested replacement schedule and something happens, you're probably liable if somebody sues you. So that's, Joe had springs, they were, I still have the springs from his Reformer, and they, rusted, but you could still use them.
Yeah.
I mean, there's ways to, you can use these springs for a long time, and I've also had springs that I've had springs break.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
I've had a couple, over 30 years, I think I've had 2 or 3 springs break. Sometimes if you have wall units, people push the push-through bar, and if things are not set, you can put a ding or a dent in, and stretch the spring funny. And once you've done that, then you've compromised the integrity of the spring, and it has more likeliness to possibly break. If it has certain coatings, your spring has coatings, it can be more likely to have microfractures and have a problem. So there's different things. So depending on, there's lots of things. So, my suggestion is that you pretty much follow that order, even though, if you're in a studio for 30 years, well, after 30 years, you have 10 sets of all, and you have 4 reformers, you got a lot of extra springs.
Well, you probably don't keep them.
Well, I'm just saying, but, or if you, I don't know.
Well, then you just kick yourself after 10 years because you're like, oh, if only I had those original springs that I had 10 years ago.
Yeah, patina.
Yeah.
So that, that's what they say, but, and it also depends on use. I mean, if you have a home studio, you're seeing 1 or 2 people a day, that's much different than if you're like, in a busy studio that is open from 7 to 7 and it's booked the whole time and it's continually being used. That's a different story. So it all, and it's wear and tear. So it's going to depend.
Yeah. I think it also depends too, like what you were just saying, not only on in that scenario you just said, but also, how many clients are using your springs? Because if you have like your own private reformer at home and you're a teacher and you work out on it, you're like probably very careful and you don't crash the carriage and you know how to use it and you're good, but you work out once or twice a week. It's different than, if you have clients, because a lot of times clients aren't quite as careful and they might crash in and out, and that could cause wear on the springs or all kinds of things that clients might do haphazardly.
So let me say this: I have never seen or heard of a reformer spring breaking.
Rachel had one break.
Oh.
She had 2 break.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, now I've heard of it. I've never seen it.
She could show you.
Okay. But because usually so something might, and again that happens more often because when you have a spring like this and you do this and you let it come together like that, that banging is not good for the spring. So when we teach people that to control the carriage on the way in, well, that's beneficial for your springs, because if people just let go and let that bang back in and bang back in and bang back in, you're potentially creating micro fractures into the metal that over time can be something that will fracture.
So I'll ask one more question that was sent before we go.
Okay.
And that is, can you switch springs depending on if your client is weak? Can you use an arm spring as a leg spring?
Well, it says that in our manual. Romana would do that. You can sometimes use a leg spring or an arm spring. That tends usually when you look at the sequencing, right? It would be light, heavy, light, heavy.
Okay.
So if you're using a light arm spring, you wouldn't want to use the leg spring yet. If you're using a heavy leg spring and it's a big guy and he's got the strength that he can control, then you might want to go into and use one of the leg springs. And it's not something you do often. Okay. And it really depends on the person and what you're, Now, if you're using it for the leg, though, you could use an arm spring for the leg because it's lighter, but I wouldn't do that for the upper extremity because it's, it would be off that way.
So you're saying you can use an arm spring as a leg spring if somebody is weak.
Right.
But you wouldn't use a leg spring as an arm spring, or?
Well, unless they're really big and strong, because it's too much. Where you can damp down, but to damp up, you really have to have the strength, and there has to be a better reason for that. So it's more about damping down.
Okay.
And and again, this is. What I see this all the time. It's like the classical, you follow the order, you can't change anything, you got to do. That's just not how it works. Romana would modify and adjust for, if you need it, and I have the springs, you modify it. And it appears that that's what Joe did too, because he had all those extra springs as well. Well,
we do teach fencing with the leg springs.
Right.
So that'd be one time.
Well, but that fencing is considered a men's exercise.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. It's, so there's things where, it says either arms or leg springs. That's what I'm saying. It is done that way, but it's usually for the men, and it's because they're bigger, and the arm springs, it's like they want to get stronger and they want to get more strength, and you would add that to that.
Meanwhile, I can barely do it with a arm spring.
So you need the baby chair spring.
Yeah, I do.
Right. Well, but that's what that's the thing. It's much easier to damp it down for a modification than it is to damp it up. Because that's most of the time that's not the case. And you have to remember that if you damp it up and the problem with that is then they start to get into the extremity and not into the powerhouse. If they can control the powerhouse with that, and it's more balanced, right? Because it's always about a balance between that stability and mobility. And if you get somebody really big and really strong, then they may need that little extra, but most people don't. Joe's setting is for, the average person, right? Not the normal, but the average. There's a difference between normal and average.
Well, he did say there are almost no normal people.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So the average person, and I always talk about the bell curve. So you have to have that bell curve. That's what you want to do. You want to build that. That strength in that relationship, and the springs that he has pretty much match that, except for the leg and the arm. And again, when you look at most women, the light works well, and for men, the heavy usually works well, but not always. You get a 5'2" guy that weighs 90 pounds, he's going to need the baby arm strings. But if you get a 7'6", 350-pound guy, that arm spring's not probably going to do it for him.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay?
Thank you.
Yep.
And now tomorrow, we have a special guest joining us. So at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, I will be leading a discussion between Kira Lamb and Sean. And I think everyone watching probably knows Kira because she's a member of our community. She's a Pilates teacher, very active on social media, and a friend of mine as well, and a student. And she did the Sean's Bridge program. So she's going to be talking about her introduction to Pilates, and she has an interesting introduction to Pilates, which she will tell us about tomorrow, and her career, and then what led her to do the bridge eventually. So that'll be tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Looking forward to that one.
Yep. All right,
Okay.
Everybody. Thanks for joining as always.
Thanks,
I really
everyone.
appreciate it. I'm hoping that you're gaining the information that you didn't know before, and
Yeah.
if you did, great. And if a little review never hurts.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Bye.